I have always enjoyed exploring trails and isolated areas. The feeling of being away from everything has always brought me peace. But after what I found in a clearing in the middle of the forest, I have never been able to relax while walking alone again. Some things are better left in the dark. This happened about 2 years ago. It was an ordinary weekend, and I decided to explore a little-known trail in a remote area of my city. I parked the car near a narrow path and continued on foot. The forest was dense, with tall trees blocking the sunlight, making the place darker than it should be. I was excited at first, but as I ventured further, I began to feel a strange weight in the air. It was as if the forest was too still, no wind, no chirping of birds or buzzing of insects, just silence. That's when I saw the first bone. At first I thought it was just a remnant left by some wild animal, a deer perhaps. But as I kept walking, I began to find more bones, ribs, skulls, jaws. They were scattered across the ground, but had some organized arrangements. There were small piles, almost as if they had been placed there intentionally. I felt uncomfortable, but I continued exploring. My curiosity has always been stronger than my fear. I reached a clearing further ahead and realized something even worse. In the center of the open space, there was a circle made of bones. They were aligned with precision, forming a pattern that looked deliberate. I started taking pictures, trying to understand what it was. That's when I heard the first sound. It sounded like a light rustling, like footsteps on dry leaves. I turned quickly but saw nothing, just trees and shadows. I kept looking around, trying to find an explanation. Perhaps a hunter or someone from the area was doing strange rituals. It was then that I noticed the bones in the circle were different from the others. They were too clean, white, almost polished, as if they had been scrubbed. This didn't seem like something natural. The sound returned, louder this time. Something was moving in the trees around me. I gripped my flashlight and illuminated the trees. The light trembled in my hand, casting shadows that didn't move. That's when I saw it, a silhouette standing among the trunks. It wasn't big, but there was something about it that made me freeze. It moved slowly, almost as if it was studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The rustling returned, now coming from multiple directions. More shadows began to appear around the clearing, and the sound of footsteps echoed on the ground. My breathing was heavy when I finally managed to move. I ran without looking back, stumbling over branches and leaves as I tried to find my way back to the car. When I reached the main trail, everything fell silent again. The next day, I told a friend who knew the area about what happened. He just looked at me seriously and said, "Don't go back there." I have never stepped into the forest again. Sometimes at night I still dream of the organized bones in that circle and the shadows that shouldn't be waiting for something. Report. I have always enjoyed walking alone on trails, exploring isolated and tranquil areas. But one particular trail completely changed that feeling. Since that day, I avoid remote places. It was a Sunday afternoon when I decided to explore a forest on the outskirts of my city. I had heard about the area but had never been there. The entrance to the trail was marked by an old, rusty sign. The path seemed little used, surrounded by dense trees and dark shadows. At first, everything seemed normal. The air was fresh, and the sound of leaves in the wind created a calm atmosphere. But as I progressed, I noticed something was off. The forest became too silent. No sound of birds, no rustling of small animals, just silence. I kept going, trying to ignore the discomfort. That's when I saw the first pile of bones. They were scattered among dry leaves. Some were small, probably from animals, but others were larger. There were clean skulls and ribs with no signs of flesh or fur. I thought they were remnants of a hunt, but the further I walked, the more bones I found. They were arranged intentionally, Some stacked, others forming strange patterns. I approached to examine them. Some bones had marks like deep burns, and others were charred at the ends. The wind suddenly blew, making the branches creak. That's when I heard a sound behind me. It was a light rustling, like leaves being stepped on. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. The feeling of being watched intensified. I shone my flashlight, but the shadows created by the trees didn't move. When I turned to continue, I saw another pile of bones, this time in the middle of the path. It hadn't been there before. My heart raced. I stood still, trying to understand what was happening. That's when I heard a loud crack, like a branch breaking. The sound came from behind me. I shone the light in that direction and saw something moving between the trees. My instinct told me to run, but my legs felt glued to the ground. The silhouette in the shadows was low, almost crouched, and seemed to move slowly. I couldn't make out details, but its presence was unsettling. I took a deep breath and started to walk backwards, trying not to make noise, but the sound of footsteps continued to follow me. Suddenly, something fell from high up in a tree, a large bone that hit the ground hard enough to echo. "Run!" The sound of footsteps quickened, matching my movements. I glanced back for a moment and saw the shadow getting closer. I reached the car breathless, my hands trembling as I unlocked the door. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the forest, motionless, watching. Since that night, I avoid remote trails and forests. Some places are meant to be forgotten, and certain things, like the bones I found, should remain buried. Report 3. I have always been a practical person. I don't believe in ghosts or haunted house stories. At least, I didn't believe until I spent that night alone in an old house I inherited from my grandfather. I should have sold the place as soon as I saw it. But out of curiosity or stubbornness, I decided to spend a night there. And it was enough to change my life. A house built in a rural area, surrounded by empty fields and a few dry trees scattered around the property. The roof was crooked and the windows had cracks, but the structure seemed solid. I arrived around 6 p.m., still with enough light to explore. The rooms were large, with old furniture covered in sheets. The smell of old wood and dust hung in the air. I went to the kitchen, where I found a trap door in the floor, the access to the basement. I didn't think much about it at the time. I just locked the door and continued checking the rest of the house. The plan was simple: spend the night, make some repairs the next day, and decide what to do with the place. But as soon as the sun set, something changed. The darkness inside the house felt different. Even with the flashlight on, I felt as if the shadows were heavier, denser. The silence was also unsettling. There was no wind, no insects, just an absolute emptiness. As I was setting up my sleeping bag in the living room, I heard the first sound. It was a faint scratching coming from underneath the floor. I thought it was rats or wood creaking, but the sound continued. Now it seemed like something was scratching at the trap door. I slowly got up and shone the light toward the kitchen. The trap door was closed, but the sound persisted. I approached cautiously. My breathing was heavy and my heart raced with each step. When I touched the latch, the sound stopped. I stood still for a moment, trying to hear something, but everything fell silent. Then came the thud. Something slammed hard against the trapdoor, making the wood vibrate. I stepped back, almost knocking over the flashlight. "Is anyone there?" My voice came out trembling. There was no answer. Just another scratch, longer this time. I fought against the impulse to run. I grabbed a metal rod I found in the corner of the kitchen and unlocked the trapdoor. I lifted the lid slowly, expecting to see rats or some wild animal. But the basement was empty, just darkness and the smell of damp earth. A flashlight illuminated the wooden stairs leading down. At the bottom, I saw an old rug and some boxes scattered around. I stepped on the first step and the wood creaked loudly. Then I heard it, a whisper. Frozen in place, I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but the sound continued. It was low, almost like words, but quick and disjointed. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I descended another step. In the corner of the basement, I saw something that made me stop. It was a pile of small bones. Some still had remnants of fabric attached. I fled the basement as fast as I could and locked the trapdoor. I ran out of the house without even grabbing my things. I returned the next day with the police. They investigated the basement and said the bones were animal remains. But something in their expression showed they didn't believe it. I never went back into that house. I sold the property for a low price just to get rid of it. To this day, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I still hear the sound coming from the basement. Certain places hold secrets that should remain buried.